Welcome to the next episode of Called to the Bar, International Law Over Drinks, a series of casual conversations about current issues in international law, life in academia, and whatever else is on our mind. Remember, in these conversations we are speaking off the cuff and without benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. I'm Dr. Juliette McIntyre, Senior Lecturer in Law at Adelaide University, and today we are talking about Blockade. Yes, who would have thought that naval blockade and clashes with the Pope would be headlines in the big year of 2026, but here we are. Joining me today is a special guest, Dr. Phillip Drew, Fellow of Queen's University Centre for International and Defence Policy. Phil is a former military intelligence officer and legal officer in the Canadian Armed Forces and taught at the ANU for several years, making him an honorary Australian. To round out the panel, we have our in-house Law of the Seas specialists, Associate Professor Tamsin Phillipa Paige of Deakin University and Professor Douglas Guilfoyle of UNSW Canberra. Howdy, gang.
Hello.
Welcome to the pod. So, of course, we have to begin with our first question. What's your drink? Phil?
A nice Australian Shiraz.
Excellent choice. We thoroughly approve. We should, of course, note the time difference.
South Australian?
Yes, sir. Or, excuse me.
Excellent.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. South Australian.
Well,
Excellent.
so it's obviously earlier in the morning here. Last night, even though it was a Tuesday, I was indulging in a South Australian Marsanne Viognier blend, the hermit crab blend from the Darrenberg wineries, which I was really enjoying, and then realized that one of the reasons I was really enjoying it was that it had suspiciously long and thick legs, and was in fact 14%, which was kind of not a Tuesday night drinking wine, lamentably. But this morning I've had my, because we're recording at 9:30 Australian Eastern Seaboard time, I've already had my coffee in my Called to the Bar mug with oat milk, because I like that extra nutty texture. But now onto the really hardcore stuff, the water.
Tamsin, I can see your mug as well. What have you put in it?
The salt water. The salt water.
So I have a coffee. It's from my Adelaide Coffee Roasters Patio coffee. But I had the end of a bag of one blend and the start of a bag of another blend when making this batch of coffee. So it's definitely not an intended flavor profile, but it'll do. So yes, coffee because it's early and I'm really proud of myself. I managed to even have breakfast before making it to this 9:30 recording.
Well done.
Tamsin, one of my favorite memories of working and living in Australia is doing walks with you in the morning and your cold pressed coffees. They were fantastic, and I really miss that.
Well, you should just come back and we can go walking. My dog still likes to walk. I still make great coffee.
Well, you just tell the Australian government that they need to change their policy so that they can hire me again.
I'll do what I can. My partner works in policy on migrant workers, so I'll have a chat with her and see what she can organise. Noting for any Australian government people listening that was a joke.
I think the Phil Drew visa class sounds a perfectly sensible idea if there are any government legal officers listening.
Which we know there are. We've heard that they do listen. Some of them. Shout out to our government lawyers. G'day.
Anytime between the end of November and the beginning of May, I'm good. I can be there.
Amazing.
We'll work on it.
We'll work on it. Now, look, and actually, I can round out the coffee and wine situation nicely because I'm also having an ice-long black that I made with beans from Vinterloper, which is a winery here in South Australia. So. There you go. Now, look.
Coffee and wine together at last.
At last. All right. Now, look, we have to begin with a little bit of a biography because Phil, of course, is a first-time guest of the pod. And our listeners always love to hear career stories. So, Phil, recent retirement does not excuse you. Can you tell us a little bit about your international law journey? Where did you start and where did you end up and what happened in between?
Oh, my. Okay. I joined the Canadian military after finishing high school in 1983. I'm far younger than I look, or I'm Did I say that right? Anyways, whatever. I joined in 83 and did my degree through the military and became an intelligence officer thereafter. Then in 1994, I was in Rwanda at the beginning, or correction, just at the end of the genocide, and just as the Australians were beginning to get there as well. And there was a night, and I'm going to call it a dark and stormy night, where we had just come back from a particularly awful experience, and the lawyer who was with us, there were two lawyers actually, one who was Bruce Oswald, and then the Canadian lawyer, and I think many of you know Oz. And they sat down with me, and we were chatting. And I was the intelligence officer. These two guys were the lawyers, and they said, "Phil, why don't you become a lawyer?" And I said, "I don't have the brains for that." So I came home, and after the tour was done in January, and I spoke with my wife, and she said, "Go for it." So that began my journey into law. And in Canada, we don't have immediate entrance into an LLB program. We have a JD program, which follows an undergrad. So I had already done my undergrad, and under sponsorship of the military, I pursued my law degree. I did my law degree at Queen's University, joined the Judge Advocate General branch of the military, and then then ended up doing my LLM at Queen's University as well on Blockade. And during that period of time, I was working at the Canadian Forces Military Law Center, and I was involved in a project at San Remo, where I met Wolfgang von Heinig, who is, as we all know, those of us who are involved in maritime and naval law, he is the god of blockade. And my good friend Rob McLaughlin and Wolf and I wrote one evening for dinner in Newport in the States, and we started talking about a PhD. So I did my PhD under Wolf, and I did my PhD in blockade law. And shortly thereafter, I retired from the military, worked for the UN for a while, and then in 2016, I started teaching at ANU, and I was there until 2020, at which time I had to scoot out of the country and get home to my wife because the pandemic had begun. So I got one of the last flights out of Australia in March of 2020, and I haven't been back since. It's killing me. So that's my international law career.
I'd like to say that we miss you here in Australia, but more importantly, we miss your maple syrup here in Australia.
Thanks, mate.
I had my maple syrup confiscated. I used to live in Canada. I was trying to come back through New Zealand, and the New Zealanders took it from me. I wasn't allowed to bring it into the country. Now look, Phil is obviously, from that introduction, the guy to ask questions of Blockade. And now look, I don't really know anything about this subject, which is kind of amusing because Douglas and I actually met as a result of me, I will say, rather audaciously critiquing his British yearbook piece on the Mavi Marmara incident, which, of course, was part of a flotilla of ships.
That was a good article.
Yeah,
that was a good article.
It was a great article, and I had absolutely no business critiquing it. But of course, that was a flotilla of ships that was trying to break the Israeli blockade over Gaza back in 2010. So, educate me, please. Tell me, blockade. What is it?
Actually, it's quite simple. Blockade is the blocking of all commercial maritime traffic into and out of an area. So the one that we are most interested in these days is Iran. So the United States, for example, has stated that the ports of Iran, all ports in Iran, are under a blockade. So the blockade stops all vessel traffic from coming in or leaving any Iranian ports.
So, and Phil, in our pre-chat, you made the point that there's been a lot of inaccurate media reporting around the idea that the US is in fact blockading the Strait of Hormuz. So could you explain why that's an important distinction, and also perhaps tell us a little bit about the idea of neutral commerce during a blockade?
All right. Pardon me. So if we look at basic international law, it tells us that you're not allowed to blockade any type of international strait. And oh my gosh, where are my case names going right now? The preeminent case in international law.
Corfu Channel?
Corfu Channel. There we go. Corfu Channel told us that. And so does UNCLOS tell us that international straits are not to be blocked, or that no state can purport to close an international strait. So if you were to try to blockade a state or a strait, there are several issues here. First, a blockade goes against ports or coastlines of a country. So you cannot, by definition, you cannot blockade a strait. But also by law, you cannot block that strait or stop neutral vessels from going in and out of that strait or through that strait. So that's part of UNCLOS. It's Corfu Channel. That's the law. You cannot block that. Now, unfortunately, there are some very senior people in the United States who don't understand that. And but I am so fundamentally impressed with the U.S. Navy for ensuring that, in spite of what some people in Washington may be saying, they're following the law, and they are not blocking. They definitely are not blocking the Straits of Hormuz. If anybody's blocking the Straits of Hormuz, it's Iran. It's illegal. And from everything that I've seen thus far, the United States is following the book on blockade to the extent that they have engaged not only in blockade law, but in the law of contraband to deal with what we call continuous voyage or ultimate destination of cargo. And I can talk about that a little bit more later on. But that's, for me, this idea that they have engaged the Declaration of London from 1909, and they're following it to the T. The first time in 117 years that any country has followed the Declaration of London this closely. Okay, they are not only following it, they're abiding by the obligations that the United States made in the deliberations for the Declaration. One thing I must note is that the Declaration was never, although it was supposed to become an international treaty, it didn't reach that, not because of the operational provisions of the Declaration, but because of a disagreement over the prize court that would have been set up. And there was a deadline by which time the prize court had to be established. It didn't get established, so the Declaration of London never became a treaty. But it does form the basis of customary international law for blockade. And for the first time in history, it is being followed to the T, and it's the United States Navy that's doing it. And it impresses me. I'm delighted to see that, in spite of all that has happened in the last 7-8 months in the realm of maritime law, that the United States Navy is stepping up, and they're actually doing it by the book. And hats off to them. Incredibly professional way of dealing with this blockade.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Doug, you had...
Yeah. So just a couple of points. Thank you, Phil, for that exposition. But my role in this pod is often to kind of take a couple of steps back and go, okay, for people who don't understand some of the terminology we're using, this is where it sits. So there are a few things I'd like to pull out of that before, and Phil can then sort of tell me what I've got wrong and where it fits in. But the first one is the status of, and I think Tamsin's got a point or two to make after me, First one's the status of international straits. So one of the things that's interesting here is Phil has referenced the Corfu Channel case. So that tells us that where a strait is used for international navigation, a narrow area of water connecting two significant bodies of the seas, you have a non-suspendable right of innocent passage. So this was to do with the pre-UN Convention on the Law of the Sea idea that effectively, if you've got a narrow body of water or overlapping territorial seas, the concept that everyone was used to was that of innocent passage. So you say innocent passage persists, but there are no exceptions. It can't be suspended by the coastal state. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea strengthened that a bit by creating, under the convention, a regime of transit passage through international straits. And that right of transit passage shall not be impeded. So that language is kind of stronger than the customary rule and was designed to kind of deal with two situations. One was that we now had a broader territorial sea. The territorial sea was confirmed at 12 nautical miles, which meant that a lot of straits that had previously had a high seas corridor through the middle were now kind of like an enclosed commons. So you needed this treaty regime to supplement custom, and also archipelagic states got certain concessions around their internal waters. So you needed this new regime. So while it's significant at one level that the United States and Iran, neither of them are party to the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, it doesn't matter in practice for two reasons. One is we've got the customary rule from Corfu Channel, and the second is some would claim that international straits transit passage is a rule of custom anyway.
I would be one of those people.
Okay, that's fine. But obviously one of the reasons that Iran and a number of other states like Israel did not sign up to UNCLOS was they had concerns about the Straits Passage regime. And
very briefly on why I would say that is the minute they claim the 12 nautical mile territorial sea, they're accepting the other rules in UNCLOS as custom.
And that's a reasonable position. I'd take it more rule by rule, but we can shelve that for present purposes. The other thing I'd say is that when Phil says, the Declaration of London sets out the customary international law, a couple of people with a more passing familiarity with the law of armed conflict might be scratching their heads and go, but wait a minute, what about the Geneva Conventions? Didn't we sort of sit down in the 40s and the 70s and codify a lot of the law of armed conflict? And the big exception there is largely the law of naval warfare, right? So you've got a convention dealing with shipwrecked people at sea, but you don't have a fully codified body of law in the way that you do in other areas. And so one of the problems we actually have, I think we'll get to this when we get into more detail, is because customary law is typically not as written down, although we have documents like the Declaration of London that do a lot of that work for us, how that older law interacts with new principles in the law of armed conflict like proportionality and targeting law is kind of unresolved. And that opens a space for something that I think we'll come to, which is competing expert manuals. So one of the sort of soft law sources we've got in this space are things like the San Remo manual, which Phil's already hinted at, and more recently the Newport manual, and we've already mentioned the town of Newport, where different groups of experts have come together and said, in the absence of a treaty governing the law of naval warfare, what do we as experts think the law is? And that's also led to some differences in interpretation. The last thing I'll say, just in case anyone's going, what the hell is a prize court? So, prize was the technical term for, what a captured ship. And the idea was that in at least pre-20th century naval conflicts, that when you captured a ship, it was meant to be adjudicated to see whether it had been legally confiscated or not, and who should get the value of the ship and the goods on board. So this is, in a sense, a kind of almost a pre-modern concept, but that term of prize court has stuck. So, as Phil was saying, the sticking point around the Declaration of London was whether we were going to get an international prize court. So imagine if we'd had an international prize court before we'd had the Permanent Court of International Justice.
I'd also like to point out an international prize court to adjudicate booty. That would just be amazing.
That would indeed be a title that slapped, yeah.
Funnily enough, that was the one bit I did understand because all of the prize court stuff is in the history of the creation of the permanent court and then the international court as well. So
Right.
I looked into that when
Right.
I was doing my my PhD. It was the one part I was like, oh, I know that bit.
And you had to deal with Douglas and I on the piracy episode where we spoke about it a bit as well.
I'm learning
Um,
things.
Now, and this is where I'm not a blockade expert. I kind of deal with maritime jurisdictions more than anything else. So correct me if I'm wrong here, both Douglas and Phil. Blockade is only a rule for international armed conflicts. It's not a non-international armed conflict category of action.
Well, that's an interesting one, isn't it? Because most most people tell you the law of naval warfare doesn't apply in non-international armed conflicts.
Yeah.
But I always like to go back to the Spanish Civil War when uh, both sides in that Civil War had very large naval fleets. And the if you stick to the idea that there is no or law of naval warfare in a non-international armed conflict, and therefore you can't have blockade, that denies the reality that actually you can have fairly large naval battles in a non-international armed conflict. And there can be parts of a country that are under control of one body or the other in a non-international armed conflict that could be effectively blockaded. Now, my friend Rob McLaughlin will tell you there's this concept of belligerence where, once one party recognizes belligerence, that means you can blockade them. He and I have disagreements over that because I tend to believe that you don't need to get to belligerence. All you need to do is get to a situation where you have an organized armed group that controls a significant amount of territory and can exercise denial of entry or exit to that area of territory. And essentially, it's the AP2 provisions for action in that, or not the provisions of action, but the provisions that bring AP2 into operation that should, from my perspective, be considered in whether or not you can conduct a blockade in a non-international armed conflict. So you've got an organized armed group that's controlling a certain amount of territory. They're essentially the government of that territory. From my perspective, one organization should be able to blockade the other. But I do buy and understand the very, very significant concern of others who say no, blockade exists only in international armed conflict because of the significant impact that it has on commercial traffic.
So so just to pick up on that for a moment, this again goes to the fact that we haven't properly codified the law of naval warfare, right? Because when we talk about belligerence, this is how basically in the pre-20th century law, we dealt with what we'd now call a non-international armed conflict. So states have always been very reluctant to recognize any law of war rights for non-state actors because these are just insurgents, rebels, whatever. We'll deal with them under our own law. International law has no role. But as always, as lawyers, we know there's an exception, right? So you have to recognize that at a certain point, this is actually so warlike that the rules of war need to apply. And that in the 19th century was the idea of recognition of belligerence. So, if you've recognized the status of this group as having a status under the law of armed conflict, then they can invoke the rules. And interestingly, in the US Supreme Court case law, again, using our new favorite word, the prize cases, there was an effort to try people who'd fought in the Civil War on the Confederate side as traitors. And the US Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. This was, in effect, a war in what we now call the international armed conflict sense. And we know it was a war because you blockaded their ports. So the act of blockade was seen as one of the ways you could recognize
Recognition of
belligerency
belligerence.
and now do what we would now call internationalize an armed conflict. But so it's again one of these really interesting historical examples for all of those reasons. But it's almost like we've kind of layered software like patches on top of each other here, and we're sort of translating terms that served a different function perhaps historically.
And this brings me to my point on the internationalization. What we functionally have going back to the Marmara incident paper is Israel recognizing Palestinian statehood functionally through blockade.
That was my that's what I said. That was the point. I was like, Doug had it as a non-international armed conflict, and I'm like, surely, I'm like, who are they blockading? It's the internet. It's anyway. Okay, hooray! I feel validated.
Functionally, not like that's a side note, but I kind of wanted to say, look, at a logical level, there's a strong argument.
But there are a number of commentators who will suggest that Israel has recognized belligerency of the Palestinians, not Palestinian statehood. And that is a significant issue in respect to that blockade that's going on there.
And that's reasonable. And on the note of UNCLOS and custom, going back to Douglas's point about rule by rule, I disagree on that for a couple of levels. Is first of all, UNCLOS was always written as a omnibus codification. It has been accepted as custom by states that aren't party to it, including the former Soviet Union and the US. And it is also actually logically incompatible to be able to accept a 12 nautical mile territorial sea that encloses a strait but not accept the transit passage rules. And it leads to accept the existence of archipelagic states with transit passage through archipelagic states without accepting other rules. So I don't think that there's a legally logical acceptability of
that argument. I understand it.
Yeah. This is where we can disagree. Reasonable people can disagree.
Yeah. And I'll just flag that's a point of disagreement, perhaps for another episode. But my counter to that would be that then, if the whole package is custom, suddenly the International Seabed Authority is custom, and the very complex voting regime that's embedded in that institutional architecture is custom. And I find it really difficult to have custom international.
I think you can, because we had a separate agreement on that one, excising it somewhat. You can excise the Seabed Authority from the rest of it in terms of custom.
So let's park that.
I think that's reasonable.
We'll have an UNCLOS showdown on another episode.
I think that as the Canadian in the crowd, I have to step forward right now. It's my patriotic duty to state that the Northwest Passage is not an international strait. It is internal waters. And just in case James Kraska is listening, James, it's internal waters. So it's not an international strait. So
should we loop back?
That's a fact. We're not going to debate that any further.
Looping back to the core proposition, actually, I think one of the things would be interesting to pick up on, and sorry, Juliette, if I'm usurping hosting here, but Phil, could you step us through what are the requirements for declaring a legal blockade? Because you've said that, and it's fabulous that some branch of the United States has managed legal compliance in this particularly unsettling era. But what are the requirements for a legal blockade under the London Declaration?
All right. First, I just want to parse out a little bit of what you just said, Doug. It's interesting. The U.S. Navy is, well, it may be not even interesting. The U.S. Navy is very much aware of the fact that after everything is cleared up, they still have to operate in the Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, Persian Gulf region. And that requires them to cooperate with allies that are in CTF 150, CTF 151. The leadership role the United States plays there is fundamental. And when I think of what the United States is doing right now with respect to the blockade, and insofar as they are following the law to the T, I think it's a reflection of the United States Navy understanding the reality that after all this is done, and after there is a regime change, whether it be in Washington or in Iran, they still have to live in that region, and they still have to work in that region and cooperate in that region, doing maritime security, counter piracy, all that kind of stuff. And hats off to the US Navy for ensuring that they are following the law and setting an example for the rest of us. Good on them.
So what is it exactly like? So I'm curious. Yeah, I want to break this down just a little bit more. So we said you said the Iranian blockade or blockage of the Strait was illegal, and the US one
Correct.
is lawful and is complying. Can you step me
The
through?
US blockade is lawful. Yes.
Yeah. And so what exactly like what why are they different? Is it just because the US
Okay.
is blockading ports and Iran was more general about the overall strait, or are there particular like do you have to pin something up on a notice board somewhere? Like what do you have to do to make it
Well, they've
legal?
done, yes, actually you do. And this follows up on Doug's question that I moved away from. But um, in order to establish a blockade, first it has to be properly established. And one of the requirements is notification. So you have to tell people what you're blockading, when you're blockading it, and for how long you're going to blockade. And when you're doing that, you tell them what the geographical area is that is being blockaded. And in this case, the United States has said we are blockading all ports in Iran. So from the very south to the very north. It's a long way. Um, and they've stated that. That's the number one thing you have to do. And the way that that gets communicated is through notifications to mariners, notices to mariners. And one CENTCOM, if you look on their website, they tell you what the blockade is and what it's about and what they're blockading. It's right there. They also broadcast it on marine channels that, all vessels coming in and out of Iranian or in and out of that region are advised that Iranian ports are closed because of a blockade. You cannot leave. You cannot come back in. So that's part of it. It's the notification is a critical part, and one of the reasons that notification is a critical part is one, you have to allow time for neutral vessels to leave, and the Americans didn't give a lot of time, but they gave some time they gave notice for neutral vessels to get out of port. And it's also important for vessels that are coming to Iran to understand that they're not going to be allowed through. So in some cases, they can turn around in the middle of the Indian Ocean or wherever, or decide that they might try to breach the blockade. The other piece of a blockade is that it must be effective. And that means that it must present a danger to any vessel that is going to either try to enter or leave. There will be a danger of being intercepted by a blockading force. And we've already seen the United States has, I think as of today, they've turned back 24 or 26 vessels. They fired disabling fire into a vessel yesterday, meaning they fired rounds into the engine room. But they all, if you saw the videos on the news, before doing that, they advised the captain of that vessel that it was time for him to vacate the engine room, get everybody out of the engine room, because they're going to fire some rounds into the engine room to stop the vessel. That is exactly the way that it's supposed to be done. It is an escalation of force. You notice that they didn't sink the vessel. The vessel was not complying with the request to stop. So the United States Navy hailed the captain of that vessel and said, "We're going to stop you now. Get your people out of the engine room because we're going to disable your vessel." That is completely within the framework of how to escalate force in a blockade. Because part of the blockade is, one of the rules of blockade is you don't just go out and sink vessels because they're evading a blockade. You intercept them, and you stop them and ultimately seize the vessel or cargo. It would only be a very last resort that you sink the vessel.
That's so
Okay,
interesting. Tamsin, yeah.
I have two follow-up questions here on the legality part. The first one is in relation to that incident you're talking about, which I looked at it and went, yeah, look, that all looks pretty much in line with blockade law. But I see a lot of people in media and socials decrying this as war crimes and firing on civilian vessels, targeting civilians. I'm like, how the fuck do you deal with that level of disconnect from how the law works when you're
Okay.
discussing it? And the second question which is I think I know the answer, but I think it'd be good for our listeners to kind of hear it teased out, is how do we deal with the fact that there's no question that the US war with Iran is an aggressive war in violation of Article 2.4. I have no questions about that. How do we disconnect the lawfulness of the blockade from the Article 2.4 violation?
Easy. One is ad bellum, one's in bello, right? 2.4 is ad bellum. Once you're in bello, the law applies, no matter who started the war. You must apply the law of armed conflict. And blockade is part of the law of armed conflict. It's part of the law of naval warfare, which is part of the law of armed conflict. So, you know, and I will challenge you a little bit on the 2.4 side at some point, but not this evening. We've got too much to talk about. The point being is if you understand blockade law, if you understand concepts of escalation of force, you will see that yes, the blockade is being done by the book, as I've said so many times. And it for me, I never thought, blockade is what I do. It's my PhD or my doctorate of law. It's what I do. I never thought I would see a blockade being affected like this one is being affected. It is completely lawful. And yes, if a vessel, if a civilian vessel, if it's a neutral vessel, whatever it is, if it is trying to breach a blockade, then it is engaging in a belligerent act. And the blockading force can use force to stop it, right? Most vessels with captains who are really thinking about it understand that when they get into a fight with the big great gray war canoe that's hanging off the port, they're going to lose. So they turn around once they're told to turn around. It is a very gutsy captain who will try and run a blockade, particularly in today's world. You're not going to get through if the blockade is effective, and I think the Americans have shown us that it's quite effective.
So just a couple of points I'd like to underscore there. We talked recently in the assassinations episode about that, which again, some listeners may find kind of contradictory, that once you're in an armed conflict, the use in bello, everyone gets the same rights regardless of who's in the right and who's in the wrong at the outset. So interestingly, as we've already said, blockade is one of the things that could start an aggressive war. It's in the 1974 UN definition of aggression in Resolution 3314 as one of the prohibited acts of aggression. But that is a use ad bellum violation. That's a charter level violation. Once you're in the armed conflict, you get this full package of rights. Now, some, again, may find that counterintuitive, I suppose, at a moral level, but the pragmatic response from the law of armed conflict has always been everyone will think they're in the right. If we have a different package of rights for those who are in the right and those who are in the wrong, then we are not going to be able to run wars in a way that minimizes the risks for civilians. And also, while Drew is completely correct that if you attempt to run a blockade and if you repeatedly resist efforts, for example, at boarding, you become a legitimate target under the laws of belligerency. Actually, it's one of those interesting points where you almost start with something more like a use of law enforcement force paradigm. It's escalated and it's graduated. And so just firing at a ship full of civilians doesn't make something a war crime, because that's something a Coast Guard might have to do in a law enforcement operation anyway. right? Disabling fire at an engine room is something that crops up in classic law of the sea cases like MV Saga number 2. Now, there are less and more sensible ways of applying disabling fire to a vessel at sea. And as Phil has said, it is something you do with consideration for things like the risk to life at sea. So using, minimum and graduated force to stop a vessel that is non-compliant is usually the way that professional navies and coast guards will go about these things.
If I may here, I questioned why they didn't fire warning shots, and then I thought about it. I've been through the Straits of Hormuz on several occasions. I've been through on naval ships 5 times. 5 times, yes. And the issue in firing warning shots in Straits of Hormuz is those rounds have to land somewhere, and the Straits of Hormuz is actually really, really narrow, and there are vessels everywhere. So you don't just fire a round in front of a ship because you don't know what it's going to hit within the next several miles, because a naval shell is going to go probably 5 or 6 miles before it impacts the water or whatever else it's going to hit on the way. So, in some cases, in an ideal world, you would give a warning shot. However, you have to take a look at the geography and the naval traffic in the area, and that can help you understand why they may have gone straight to a shot into the engine room. Because if a shot's going into the engine room, it's probably not going to come out the other side of the ship and hit anything 4 or 5 miles downrange, like an innocent vessel or something along that lines. So, sorry, Doug.
This is all suddenly making so much more sense to a complete novice like me. So I just wanted to clarify, I guess, for myself and for the listeners. So what is it that makes Iran's blockade unlawful, as it were? Like, is it just because they didn't do any notification, or Doug is waving
it's not a
hand.
blockade. Sorry.
It's not a blockade.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
So they are, and 2. So first off, calling it a blockade of the Straits, what Iran is doing, is a misnomer.
Yeah.
So what they have done is to say no traffic may move through this body of water, and if it does, we may attack it. So that breaches several principles, right? Because a blockade is, as Phil's put it, about ports. You specify the ports, and those ports have to be the port of an enemy belligerent. Mm-hmm. So unless you're saying we are at war with the entire world and all ports are closed, but then you could be
pirates, when they say that, are engaging in rhetoric, not legal declaration.
Yeah.
I have to say it.
But also then a blockade couldn't be effective, right? And that's a requirement of a blockade. So what they are doing is they are, literally what their actions are doing is to impede passage through an international strait through threat of force. So it's not discriminate. It doesn't discriminate between belligerent and neutral traffic. It's, as it were, an attack on almost everyone except a couple of countries they like. And it violates that regime that keeps the strait open. Whereas the US blockade says, so long as you're not calling at an Iranian port, you can still move through the Strait of Hormuz. Okay, so one is about everyone's transit through a body of water, and the other is applying a set of restrictive rules. I think one thing would be really, because we are going to come to time quite soon, one thing I'd really like to hear from Phil on, because it's a very interesting point he makes in his book, and it's one of those issues where I think the clash of old and new law gets at its sharpest, is when does a blockade become illegal? So you don't get to do whatever you want just because you've declared a blockade. So Phil, if you could talk for a minute or two about, at what point can we say a legally declared blockade loses that status?
First point would be when it blocks access to neutral ports. A blockade cannot block access to neutral ports. Another good reason you can't blockade an international strait, because an international strait, blockading an international strait, which I said can't do, would block access to neutral ports. Blockade can also become unlawful if its sole purpose is to starve the civilian population. Now, that would be a very, very hard case to prove. And this is where we also get into a bit of a conflict between the San Remo Manual and the Newport Manual on the Law of Naval Warfare. So when I did my PhD, I was very, very critical of the San Remo Manual's ideas of importing proportionality into a blockade. And when I'm talking proportionality, I'm talking in bellow proportionality, targeting proportionality. And I came at it from several points. First, it was very clear that those who negotiated Additional Protocol 1 definitely wanted to exclude blockade from the provisions of the proportionality regime. Additionally, if you take a look at how the proportionality test is done, it is an anticipatory test. It states that before conducting an attack, you must do the assessment to determine whether or not the damage that you are going to impose upon a civilian or civilian property is excessive in relation to the direct and concrete military advantage anticipated. Now, blockades generally for the first while do not have a lot of an economic effect on a country. The longer they go on, the worse the effect becomes, and it becomes exponential, particularly if the civilian population starts to starve. Such was the case in the blockade of Germany during the armistice between November 11th, 1918 and April of 1919, when the peace was finally signed. There was a blockade imposed on Germany, and it became horrific. More civilians or more people died as a result of that blockade than the Germans lost in the strategic bombing campaign of the Second World War. Okay, these people died of starvation and disease. It is impossible at the beginning of a blockade operation to try and figure out how bad this is going to get for the civilian population. A proportionality test, as I said, is anticipatory. You're supposed to be able to assess what kind of damage is going to be done. If you cannot assess that type of damage, then you can't have a proportionality test. And in the face of an exponentially worsening situation, it's impossible. So I really like the way that the U.S. Naval War College manual dealt with this. And it says, if you have a sole purpose of starving the population, then your blockade is unlawful. But it also indicates that you must allow humanitarian access through. And the Americans, if you take a look at the blockade announcement for CENTCOM, have stated they're going to allow humanitarian access. And I think that's the way to do it. The proportionality it's illogical. It was something that was brought in 1992. And I remember 1992 quite well. As I was an intelligence officer at the time, but I was also involved in UN missions. And we thought the world was going to be a peaceful place going forward, and that all these things would come together and work for us. And that's why they pulled the proportionality idea into blockade. It was never a part of customary law, and it hasn't become part of customary law because nobody has ever done it. So the idea is there in San Remo, but it's definitely not customary law. It was just a statement, an attempt at creating soft law. And thus far, nobody has done it. And even when we had the opportunity to do it in the Iraq case, when we blockaded Iraq for such a long time, a lot of people starved to death in Iraq. Had we engaged some type of proportionality test, we would have said, this is ridiculous. But the UN did not do that. So, hats off to the folks who did the San Remo manual. It was an incredibly good manual, but I've always had issues with the blockade part on it. And I think the U.S. Naval War College, Rob McLaughlin, Dave Letts, Wolf Henschel von Heineck, Jim Kraska, these guys are at the very top of their game. From my perspective, they got it right with respect to moving the idea of proportionality out of blockade law where it never really belonged.
Following up on that, and just as a really brief aside, because of the timing of the current US blockade of Iran, there have been claims that I have seen, and we've discussed it a little bit in chat already, that the introduction of the blockade violated the ceasefire. How do we deal with that notion?
No. Blockade is an act of war. And there are some people saying, yeah, but Congress hasn't agreed yet there to this yet. Well, they've been bombing the country for a number of weeks. Guess what? It's a war, right? We know
Oh yeah,
that.
yeah. International
Okay?
law doesn't care what Congress says.
No, exactly. So and I fall back to the World War I example. The blockade was affected by the Allies against the Germans beginning in November of 1918 to keep pressure on them, to force them to the table in 1919, and to force peace upon them. From my perspective, this is the smartest move the United States has made in this war. They are finally figuring out how to hurt Iran. And the way to hurt Iran right now is to cut it off from its $200 million a day worth of oil. You stop that from flowing, all of a sudden Iran is going to start going broke faster than any form of sanction could have done. This is the way to keep the pressure on Iran and get them to come to the table. And if the I still don't really know why the United States is at war against Iran. It's never been clearly explained. I've seen about 6 or 7 different explanations from the same person. But if the idea is to get Iran to stop producing or acquiring nuclear weapons, the United States has disabled their military to the point where they can carry out a blockade without getting blown out of the water. And this is the time to do it. And they should keep the pressure up using the blockade as a very, very effective way of ensuring that Iran gets back to the negotiating table and negotiates in good faith. Because this is the way to really cripple Iran.
I think that's a nice segue into my last question before we head into the wrap up, which is, I know everyone knows the name Straits of Hormuz largely because they're concerned about the effect on their gas prices or their petrol prices, right? So I saw one meme that asked, how do two closeds make an open? And I think our listeners would just love to hear, in more political terms, perhaps, what's the result here on oil passing through the Strait? Is the US blockade going to allow more oil through, or are we still all in trouble on that front? Doug has his hand up as well.
So can I'll take a first stab at that. So I think the political idea from the US side is that at the moment, Iran's trying to run a game where it gets to choose what oil goes through the Strait and who gets it. So they say, you're fine to go through if you're a country we like. And so what the US is essentially doing is trying to enforce the Straits regime and say, okay, you either let everyone through or none of your trade gets through. So the aim is actually to open up the oil trade again. So that's how two closed makes an open, because actually what Iran was doing was in effect partially closing it. So the political pressure the US is trying to apply in Phil's terms is to say, no, everyone gets access or no one gets access. That's the decision you have to make. Also, on Tamsin's point about does this violate a ceasefire, the other point I just make is ceasefire is a non-legal concept, right? Ceasefire is a political agreement that we're going to suspend hostilities to a certain degree so we can negotiate. That is not relevant to anything from a purely legal point of view.
Mm-hmm. And also, insofar as it's being affected against commercial vessels, it's not as though they're attacking Iran right now. They're just stopping commercial vessels. They're beyond beyond putting a couple of rounds into the engine room the other day. there's no kinetic force being used. This is a presence type of operation, and they are just denying access into and out of Iranian ports for everybody. As Doug noted, it's for everybody. You don't get to choose.
All right.
All or nothing.
I have learned so much from this. The news suddenly makes a lot more sense. So I hope it's the same for our listeners. But it is unfortunately time to wrap up, as wonderful as this conversation has been. And of course, when we wrap up our episodes, we always ask first-time guests the three dreaded question. And so, Phil, these are all for you. The first is, of course, what recommendations do you have for anyone who would like to know more about what we've been discussing today? The second one is, what are you working on? Yeah, I know. Chance for you to plug your book. The second question is always, what are you working on at the moment? And I hope to hear that it's a gardening project or something, given your recent retirement. And then the third is, what escape routes can you recommend to our listeners to either read or view if they wish to get their mind off of international law?
All right. First question is, what would I recommend? Well, yeah, I have a book, but I have to rewrite it because it's aimed at a level of knowledge that not a lot of people have. So I have to make it more simple. So if you want to understand what's going on with blockade law, read the U.S. Naval War College manual on the law of armed conflict at sea. Okay, it's called the Newport Manual. I think that they give you a pretty good overview. And also take a look at the San Remo manual and see what you think of proportionality. I don't want to tell you how to think. Think for yourself and figure out whether you agree with the idea that proportionality has no place in blockade, or whether you think that it does. That's as legal minds. Don't let me tell you how to think. What am I doing right now? My daughter's getting married in our yard in June. Remember, June here is December in Australia, so it's like Christmas. My daughter's getting married here in our yard, and we have a 10-hectare yard, and I have to get it ready for a wedding. So there's a lot of work to be done. It's going to be done. The wedding is going to be conducted in our barn. So it's quite a big project. That keeps me busy these days, and that's my retirement job. For escapes, watch ice hockey. Okay.
Yes.
And remember who the best country is in the world when it comes to ice hockey.
Finland, right? You mean Finland, don't you? But I do miss the ice hockey from living in North America.
No more maple syrup for you.
Yeah, let's not start an international incident on the pod.
And that is the other thing I do. I do make maple syrup, but the maple syrup season is over. But I do make maple syrup, and I do share it with my Australian friends when I come.
And it's fucking delicious.
So, but yeah. But yep, watch ice hockey.
Amazing.
And learn how to play, and go to Phillip's rink, slap on a pair of skates, and go for a skate.
I'm not sure. Australians on ice is an interesting thing to watch. All right. Thank you so much.
There's lots to laugh at.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And thank you to Phil in particular. And thank you to our listeners. We will see you next time. Bye-bye.